Hello and welcome to my channel NBSoundHopperUK, and the subject of this video will be 7-inch singles, 10 of my favourites. This video is a companion to one I made a few months back about some of my favourite 12-inch singles. Just as I did with 12-inch singles, I purged many 7-inch singles back in the 90s, but still have around about 100 or so. Of those, here are 10 of my favourites. Some are extremely well known, some less so. The ones I've selected cover the period from 1976 to 1984. For the purposes of this video, I'll talk about them in chronological order. First up, it's Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols from 1976. Not a great deal of introduction required for this one. Although banned from being played on the radio, the Sex Pistols found themselves not really needing the attention that airplay could give them. A live interview on the Thames TV programme Today, followed by the ensuing media outrage, ensured they got all the publicity they could have wished for. Then being dropped by record label EMI simply gave them even more. The sensitivities of mainstream media in the UK at that time and their arrogance in assuming that they could dictate what music the public listened to was something that rebounded on them in a big way. As far as the song is concerned, if you were to take something by Slade from a few years earlier, play it and produce it more loosely, and add lyrics grounded in the real world, then that's all Anarchy in the UK really is. So in hindsight, the furore seems bizarre. The B-side, I Wanna Be Me, is one of my favourite Sex Pistols songs, and these days, perhaps, over-familiarity with the A-side makes me prefer it. Like it or loathe it, this is a historic single. Spiral Scratch by Buzzcocks was released in 1977. Although not as deeply ingrained in people's consciousness as Anarchy in the UK, the Buzzcocks debut EP Spiral Scratch served as a wider-reaching model for how to get yourself heard. Self-released on the New Hormones label, it showed that having a contract with an established record label was not necessary if you had the will and determination to cobble together the money to put out your own material. Spiral Scratch is the only Buzzcocks release to feature Howard Devoto on vocals. Later he would go on to form the post-punk band Magazine. The record was produced by Martin Zero, who was actually Martin Hannett, who later made a name for himself by producing many releases on the Factory label. Of the 4 songs on Spiral Scratch, Boredom is the most well known, with its lyrics about disaffection with the world felt by many young people in the UK at the time. The other 3 tracks, Breakdown, Time's Up and Friends of Mine, are all strong too. The backing vocals on Time's Up are easily identifiable as being by Pete Shelley, who would take over as the band singer after Howard Devoto left. Next, it's Being Bored by the Human League from 1978. In the late 70s, most of what I listened to was either prog, heavy rock and metal, and a smattering of electronic music by the likes of Tangerine Dream and Jean-Michel Jarre. Because of that, my interest in other stuff was quite limited. As a consequence, I didn't get to hear the Human League until they were featured on a BBC Arts programme, Arena or Omnibus or something like that. And it was quite some time after Being Bored had been released. Hearing them proved to be quite a revelation for me, one which would ultimately lead to me drifting away from what I had been listening to. So I like Being Bored not only for the fact that I think it sounds great, but also because it's become symbolic to me of the value in being open to following a new path when the existing one appears increasingly like a dead end. This version of Being Bored, as well as its B-side, Circus of Death, I regard as the definitive ones. Both tracks were later re-recorded, but neither quite captured the rawness of the originals on this fantastic single. Electronically Yours, hell yeah. Next, Damaged Goods by Gang of 4 from 1978. One thing I didn't mention about Being Bored was the record label. It was on Scottish independent label Fast Product, with a catalogue number of Fast 4. The label didn't have to wait too long before releasing another highly influential single. The very next one, in fact, Fast 5, was Damaged Goods by Gang of 4. Although completely different in style to the Human League, Gang of 4's jagged guitar, rhythms that were closer to funk than rock, and their outspoken politics found a receptive audience. The single contained the title track, Love Like Anthrax, and Armalite Rifle. As with Being Boiled, Damaged Goods was later re-recorded for release on their debut album Entertainment. Again, I prefer the more basic and slightly slower original version on the single. Love Like Anthrax would also appear on Entertainment, although with the title truncated to Anthrax. In this case, the album version comes out on top as the feedback and distortion on the guitar have a greater effect. That's not to say Love Like Anthrax isn't worth listening to, it is. Final track, Armalite Rifle, despite the seriousness of its anti-war sentiments, has an almost naive charm, and it rounds off what was a promising debut single, promise the band were capable of living up to. Transmission by Joy Division was released in 1979. It was their first single after Unknown Pleasures, and if anyone thought their debut album was the limit of the band's capabilities, then Transmission well and truly buried any doubts. It's one of those songs where it sounds like everyone involved has hit to peak at the same time, and that extends to producer Martin Hannett, whose work was instrumental in moulding the band's sound into something quite apart from their contemporaries. Everything about the song's opening feels perfectly timed, the single synth note quickly followed by the bass and then drums, guitar and finally the vocals. And the vocals on Transmission, for my money, were Ian Curtis at or very near to his best. B-side, Novelty, a more straightforward song, holds its own with lyrics concerning the transient thrill of certain experiences, possibly the UK's punk scene being the focal point. Before I go any further, here's a glimpse at what's in store for this channel. My sixth choice is I'm in Love with the German Film Star by the Passions from 1981. As one-hit wonders go, I'm not sure it gets much better than I'm in Love with the German Film Star. Ethereal and dreamy, this single was arguably a forerunner to what, by the end of the decade, became known as shoegaze. The echoplex effect on the guitar is absolutely brilliant. Barbara Gogan's vocals and the subject of the lyrics are a superb fit for the music too. Its hit status comes from it reaching number 25 in the UK singles chart, quite a low position, it has to be said, when you bear in mind its influence. This is another single where the producer deserves a mention. Peter Wilson, an in-house producer for Polydor Records, had an especially creative 1981. Not only did he help the Passions realise the unique for its time sound of this single, but he also produced Sleep No More, the second Concert Angels album, the excellence and distinctiveness of which is no small part down to Wilson. Back to the Passions though, the B-side, Don't Talk to Me, I'm Shy, isn't bad, but it's dwarfed by the originality of I'm in Love with the German Film Star. Too Drunk to Fall by American punk band The Dead Kennedys was also released in 1981. I hate having to make concessions to the YouTube algorithm, but needs must. Therefore, along with partially bleeping out the single name and editing the sleeve image, from here on I won't refer to the song title. This was the final release in what I think of as phase one of the band's existence, which was more garage surf punk than hardcore. Singer Jello Biafra's satirical lyrics and style of delivery put the band, in my opinion, head and shoulders above the wave of punk and oi bands emerging in the UK at the same time. The single got to number 36 in the UK charts and, of course, incurred the ire of several BBC Radio 1 DJs. Anyway, the lyrics are about the pitfalls of partying a bit too much and then not being able to perform. Maybe an experience that resonated a little too much for comfort with some Radio 1 DJs. The B-side, The Prey, is very different and superb in its own right, a kind of film noir tale of a mugging told from the mugger's perspective. It contains the wonderful line, I can almost taste your dandruff, which is a piece of imagery as grotesque as it is funny. Next up, Grooving in Green by the March Violets from 1982. This band from Leeds recorded their first two singles for the Merciful Release label, which had been set up by Andrew Eldridge of fellow Leeds band The Sisters of Mercy. As with The Sisters of Mercy, there wasn't any doubt about the March Violets being a goth band. That being said, the two had slightly different approaches. In the case of the March Violets, having male and female vocalists gave them greater scope than most goth bands of that era. Their songs tended to be quite quirky as well, although not comedic in the same way that Alien Sex Fiend were. This single I consider as the most consistent of their 5 singles released between 1982 and 1984. Grooving in Green is the second of the Merciful Release singles. The A-side combines a menacing distorted guitar and a typically goth bass line, with Simon Denby and Rosie Garland singing their separate parts rather than one harmonising the other. Steam, listed as the double A-side rather than the B-side, is up-tempo and has just as much going for it as Grooving in Green. Like a few bands from Leeds at that time, they used a drum machine, but I don't think that detracts from either track. They're both fine examples of early 80s goth. Next is Good Technology by Red Guitars. Initially released in 1983 on their own Self-Drive label, Good Technology was Red Guitars' debut single. What I have is the 1984 re-release on the same label. The difference between the two is the B-side. On the 1983 version, it's Heartbeat Go, Love Dub. On the 1984 version, it's Paris, France. Regardless of whichever release, Good Technology has a looping bass line that's repeated throughout the track and great interaction between vocals and guitar. It gradually builds up, drops back and builds again, using an approach not a million miles away from what could be heard in post-rock in the 90s. In the UK during the 70s and 80s, there was a very popular TV programme called Tomorrow's World, which looked at emerging technologies in terms of what might be in store for us in the future. The lyrics to Good Technology are a bit like that, but not so upbeat, in the sense that they appear to question the real value of consumerism, the gap between the artist's impression and the eventual reality. You can have everything and nothing. It's a gem of a track. Paris, France is a decent love song with plenty of bounce, with a nice structural twist at the end, and it makes for a good counterpoint to the A-side. Finally, it's Upside Down by the Jesus and Mary Chain from 1984. At the time of its release, this single felt like something of an oddity. Sure, there was ample attitude about it to connect it to punk or post-punk, genres which, in the music press, still held some sway, but at the same time it was unlike either. The noise and feedback were crushing and in stark contrast to the vocals, which owed more to the mid to late 60s in style. Overall, it was a sort of collision between Phil Spector, psychedelia and punk, and little did anyone realise that the Jesus and Mary Chain had unearthed a sound that would later become a vital component of shoegaze. A cover of the Syd Barrett song Vegetable Man further cements the link to the 60s. For all the noise, it didn't seem to have the bish-bash-bosh, break-it-all-apart approach to a cover version that was often a feature of punk bands. This single was also an early release on Creation Records, a label that went on to have a big association with shoegaze by signing and releasing material by the likes of My Bloody Valentine, Ride, Slow Dive, The Telescopes and Swerve Driver. So, in retrospect, I think it's fair to say that Upside Down broke new ground. There we are, a combination of the famous, infamous and relatively obscure. One thing that struck me when preparing for this video was that for collectors, 7-inch singles must be a bit of a nightmare. Chances are they'll have been played extensively, thus increasing the likelihood of damage. Picture sleeves were made of much cheaper material than album covers, so finding them in a reasonable state must be a challenge. And with or without picture sleeves, they never had polybag liners, which were useful for preserving vinyl albums in a decent condition. Makes me glad that I'm not a collector. A playlist which features a track from the singles I've spoken about is linked in the video description, and if you've made it this far, thanks for watching.